I constantly question my connection with the ancestors. Mothers all. Are they proud of me? Or do they find me lacking? Will they judge me solely and wholly on my deeds alone? In relation to myself, the others, and those in my family line, other humans in general, nature, the cosmos, aren't they all inextricably linked? Aren't we all connected in some quantum form or fashion? It seems to me that the overarching legacy of most cultures in custom and conditioning is the will to remain. The legacy is, and has always been, to leave a legacy. Should I refuse to imprint on current culture and leave no tracy? What of the others? Is there merit to comparing notes, or at least creating a consensus as to what transcendent curses course through our collective veins? How do we create a roadmap for intergenerational healing if we are not in agreement as to what needs to be healed? How do we discern what is sacred and to be made social, or what is distinctly subjective and therefore kept silent or close to self? In short, could I heal honestly and openly? Was there intrinsic value to my suffering, to my healing? I find that even to answer these questions requires codependency on, or a deference to a committee of some sort. However, my relationship with most of those in my family are either tense, strained, or estranged. This is not at my behest, nor is it my desire. In my immediate family, I imagine it is a result of having grown up in quarters that were entirely too close. Fractured identities and mirroring make it karmically uncomfortable to be in each other's energy for too long, as we all try in our own ways to break generational curses and toxic patterns passed down. There are obvious traumas that remain less healed and more avoided with my siblings that I feel I have consciously chosen to wrestle with an attempt to find deeper meaning and relief. It might also have to do with a perspective shift after parenthood, in which I am the only of us five females to undertake the parenting task. Although they would say that not having kids is their testament to fully embracing healing at the deepest level in the denial of their biological imperative. On a universal, cosmic, and multidimensional level, if I commit to doing the work properly, I might be able to point out our originating, offending thread within this transgenerational and transcultural textile. I could, with a tug, unravel the entire tapestry of trauma and toxic patterns for all the ancestors, not just mine. The fabric of time would unwind, and I could once again liberate Adam and Eve from their cumbersome clothes, and in so doing, prevent the fall of all humanity. My father, like many of my ancestors, myself included for the most part, failed to keep their heads above water financially. It feels as if the ancestors gave their fates over to the futility of their inherent inadvertency, real or imagined. There seems to be much confusion between ritual as rites, poverty as profession, habit as hobby, codependency as coping, all feeding our baser consciousness and core beliefs. If I am as lucky in this writing as I have been my entire life given that later, I will go unnoticed. My abandonment will be my atonement, and no judgment will fall on me for the misdeeds and misfortunes I confess here, not unlike my father's atoning confessions to me on his deathbed. A lot was confessed by way of my father's choices in parentage and pedagogy of his children. Aside from leaving a legacy of athleticism and physical excellence, which are by and large positive patrimony, there were negative legacies as well. With 7 children, 5 of them girls, he was hard pressed to find a way to raise us all within warring gendered ideologies. While we were all held to a standard of physical excellence and discipline, only the girls were held to a standard of physical abstinence, as God intended. There would be no dating while under his roof, and though one or two dared to try, they were met with either a physical, mental, or emotional wall in the form of my father and his expectations. He was an unappealing, all-pervasive presence that humbled developmental hormones and threatened to permanently holster any young man's trigger-happy pistols pointed at any of his puritanical princesses. Much like the Bible, there were a myriad of contradictory messages, depending on the context, and Dad would quote whatever Bible verse best validated his argument. There was no argument that could combat corroboration from Christ. With so many children to keep organized, my parents drew on the legacy of our ancestors to lend a proverbial hand. Spare the rod, spoil the child. My father would always say, loosely quoting the Bible, Proverbs 13, verse 24. This meant that without regular spankings, children were apt to become spoiled and obstinate. He rarely spared the rod and was doing what he knew worked for his parents and their parents before them. These aggressive ghosts came out often when us children were being too loud, too rambunctious, and too much to handle. When no one would own up to a disruptive misbehavior, my dad would turn to me and say, "Tracy, I know it was you. Come and get your spanking." Despite my protests, I became the proverbial whipping boy. He would take me to a separate room where we were alone, and he would spank me lightly, or not at all explaining that he understood it was not me, but that someone had to be made an example of. Sometimes he was angry enough to spank me full force, despite my protestation, and I knew in those times that he did not care if it was me or not. His anger was so great. It took me many years before I realized the implications of having accepted this treatment for so many years without adequate therapeutic release. It has been told to me that spreading his ashes is akin to desecration or a sacrilege. And to that I say, now we are even. It took having my own child and having the desire to end that particular legacy that I began to really examine the epigenetic conditions that resulted in corporal punishment. Fears of what would happen to slave children if they were disobedient or unruly in public became clear to me with help from my past ancestors. They insisted that they were doing what was necessary to keep their kids safe at the time, but were now giving me permission to do something different with my own child. I am thankful for their guidance, clarification, and blessing. Both parents were raised in very rural areas of the southeast United States and are of African American slave mix. My mom was born at home and the doctor, being white and male, and so the voice authority on her claim to existence did not have her birth certificate signed until a week after her birth, when my grandmother was finally able to bring her into a hospital. She never knew her dad, but her mother had 4 husbands and many lovers. My mother's role as the second oldest of 4 was to care for her brothers, even if one was older than she. My grandmother worked cleaning houses and had an active social life, as is evident by her many suitors to take care of her and give her nice things. My paternal grandmother was a nurse, and I remember thinking that for her to crush cockroaches with her bare feet made her one of the toughest women I had ever known. My dad was the second oldest of 4 and spent most of his time in the church with his sermonizing father, playing sports, or tending the garden of his mother lest she beat him or his siblings with a shoe, a rake, a block of wood, or whatever else was close at hand. Just kids themselves when they met, it became more and more obvious, as I grew older, how stunted they were in aspects of their young adult development. Having learned from their obvious mistakes, I managed to outgrow them before leaving for college myself, as did most of my siblings, fleeing the roost, never to return. I suppose we all met each other out in the real world, negating any need to return home and rework those complicated relationships. They followed us around surreptitiously, waiting to usurp our progress on our chosen path to enlightenment, tugging at us like an ever attached umbilical cord, tethered to our collective origin story and shared trauma. It is for this reason that I feel the need to embrace the real work and to check myself against any toxic family, systems, and its pervasive reach into relationships in my life. I mean family by way of blood family and the family that I choose and build community with. Examining whether those closest to me are loyal and sincere in their intentions and placing those suspected of disloyalty farther in my periphery. The fact of the matter is that even the choice of social family, their roles and functions, stem from my blood family, which serves as a constant barometer for my healing. Perhaps this is why I do not have any close contact with my family and few friends to call on. I try to cultivate my relationships with great consciousness, wishing to avoid void friendships that simply mirror familial dynamics and become blind spots of projection or deflection. My healing has taken precedent to phony and superficial partnerships and affiliations. I am not trying to find individuals with compatible trauma or whose demons dance best with mine. I am only interested in the company of those souls that yearn for true salvation and are willing to suffer to see it so. This suffering to salvation path that I align myself with at present is not a path so much as a karmic cycle of suffering and salvation. The misstep from suffering to salvation indicates a karmic failure of some kind, a lack of non attachment, which may lead to liberation, the catalyst to true salvation. I think the key to this failure lies in my relationship with the others, and many others outside of that. There are so many in my family whose names I do not know, and or whose stories I cannot retain, and far more others of the community at large, whose karma I also carry systemically, or who I have come in contact with and have made a lasting karmic impression I am needing to cleanse myself of. The karmic conundrum does not lie in my insincerity, vanity, or narcissistic victimhood. It lies in my ego, as surely only ego would ask that I heal at all costs, especially in the projective analysis and comparison of the healing of those around me. I will not say that the others were not doing what they felt was their part in healing the family line. When my brother, the eldest, met his wife in college, he made sure to do things properly. No shotgun involved. Although he did not come home very often, the family made frequent road trips to the Northeast to visit him and his wife in their life there. He was, and still is, a typical older brother, dismissive, distant, and busy with his life, then leaning in with charming manipulation and overinflated promises when in need. He was mischievous in his youth, replacing our pillows with shoes when we were sleeping, double daring us to perform duties either for his amusement or personal gain, antagonizing and terrorizing. I vaguely remember being around the age of 7 and having a particularly altercation beginning with him in the kitchen with me, stabbing him in the side with the fork and him trying to shove me into the oven, which happened first. I no longer recall. It is notable because of the very real anger and fear I felt for the first time, raw and complete. Whatever I was responding to resulted in murderous violence, and intent that was so completely out of character for me, it is etched in my memory. My brother wore those scars long after, and my guilt and shame has still not faded. There is more than a little tinge of fear in that reminiscence as well of the dangerous impact of emotional dysregulation. Even now, I am terrified of the devil inside and its full, unexplored capabilities. In my middle age, I do not know what demons I may have repressed in those early stages that have lain dormant these many years. That, along with the childhood neglect that manifested as my having a ball of pet, mercury from one of the house's broken thermometer, and the metallic taste of lead in my mouth for a while. There is really no telling how this particular monster will present itself when she does. For my brother, I feared what I would have done with a loaded weapon at hand. The anger was so acute. I would say that with the fork, though. He had it coming. Since he was the eldest, he was not expected to help raise any of us or take on more responsibility. Being male, he got a pass on all housework, which was still considered distinctly feminine, and would bribe us younger kids to do any of his outside chores with promises of a borrowed comic book or a turn on the news gaming console. Outside of the house, his full focus, like most young lads, was on athletics, friends, and cheerleaders. It was my sister, the second oldest, that was recruited as a mother's helper to dampen the chaos of caretaking. When asked why they had so many children, my parents would routinely say, so that you all could look out for each other, with my older sister holding the brunt of this undertaking. I believe having us all raise and entertain each other, my parents felt that they could continue to procreate. Therefore, there was fairly consistent attunement and good enough parenting of me as a child across all of my caretakers, and made even better by the fact that my mother was constantly present, even if not actually mothering me in that moment. Depending on who was designated to watch me, there would be differing emotional containment capabilities. Everyone was able to provide some degree of care one to another before their own developmental needs called for attention, support, and validation. Therefore, there was consistent but incongruous care. This particular sister took her duty as surrogate mother seriously, but with great resentment, and rightly so. She sacrificed her youth to atone for the sins of the father, and as the oldest female, she had 5 others constantly tugging on the fertile teat of her independence. I looked up to her immensely in my youth, and I still grieve our mutual parting of ways in my young adulthood. I suppose I grew tired of honoring and submitting my will to that of the maternal mentorship that was fostered between her and I. I still feel a great deal of guilt at times for it, considering all that she was willing to offer in the way of guidance. I do not think that I was ungrateful, but I felt the tug of my own path that differed so radically from hers. I was much more dedicated to self expansion than self development, and those terms are related in nuance only, and not at all synonymous. I yearned for personal development, touching and being touched by the lives of others. My sister was focused on professional development and its practical promise of security. The next two sisters would agree to disagree. The lack of privacy in our tiny home and closeness of age led to polarizing behaviors, the mirror principle at work. With these two, I tried to be as still as possible so they would understand that the friction fraught frequencies and rocky reverberations between us was their own echo, and that I was just a sounding board for their own angst. The contrast between the highs and the lows were always too intense. The exhaustion of knowing how to push each other's buttons, all the while trying not to made for short, terse interactions for the most part. When the three of us ended up in high school all at once, and you would have thought us strangers, for all we interacted, and for all the interests we held in common. We only convened on the battlefield of sports, putting our differences aside for the greater good of pride and glory, for our school and for our father. The younger two, a boy and a girl, would appreciate me leaving them out altogether. My younger sister has been an adult from a young age, having been taken under the wing of my eldest sister. My brother, with his deep, shy sensitivity and inability to live up to the brawn and charisma of our older brother, now battles with schizophrenia, exacerbated by my mother's constant presence in his life. Having moved into his house and onto his living room couch, her mental illness drowns him and distorts, making the ridiculous seem like reality. But from an outsider's perspective, we probably all seem riddled with varying psychopathies within the medical model of mental illness. But I think we could make a case for any other human on this earth, if we are to pick each other apart, only for that diagnosis to fall away again upon further dissection. Everyone possesses an intelligible algorithm given patterning over enough time. Whether or not it can reside harmoniously within society is another question altogether. I would like to think that we can say for each other that we are all doing our best despite any appearance to the contrary. If we take this approach, however, no one could be condemned and there would be no need for a savior, or many. According to Earth's algorithm, we are overdue. Our summers were crammed with visits with anywhere from 2 to 4 cousins, extended relatives, and countless young neighbors and peers. I remember those days most fondly due to my burgeoning self distinction apart from the whole, and my ability to sit in solitude and not compete in warring egos and rife. I learned that this saved me, especially in social gatherings in which hectic hormones and kissing cousins challenge the boundaries of appropriate touch. I still do not know if I any residual blind spots here when it comes to early child sexual trauma. I dismiss it as not having been penetrating or intrusive physically, just psychological in that it was intimacy trauma, not necessarily sexual trauma, and continues to be a recurring theme for me. Having permeable emotional boundaries and a disorganized sense of safety, but a very strong sense of self, is complicated to navigate in a world of fascist monopolization masquerading as capitalism. In this world, there is money and power to be gained in the permeable emotional boundaries and disorganized sense of safety. Therein lies the locus of control. It is the strong sense of self that becomes anomalous and anarchistic. My first encounter with waning mortality was at the age of 4 in the home of my grandparents. There was a congregation of elders standing in prayer at the bedside of my great great uncle Chester, the surrogate father to my minister grandfather at the age of 2. I remember being curious about the dying process. I was too young to truly understand the resolute finality of death. But with all the traffic in and out of the room, and the serious visages and voices, diligent and earnest with prayer, I understood it as ritual, and knew that something transformational was taking place. None of the others seemed to possess a similar inquisitiveness. I could hear their screams of merry making outside the room, as I vied for a view of the decrepit body within the bedside scrum. No one shooed me out of the room. Quite the contrary. A big hand would envelop my much smaller one, and I would be added as a link to the prayer chain, or arms would lift me up and ask if I wanted to add anything to the prayer. It felt like an initiation. Outside of that room, I was one of the others, but in that room, I was one of the elders. He looked so at peace that my first impression was of death's appeal and not any potential threat, horror, or abuses. Those at the bedside bore faces wet with the remembrance of his good deeds, and were aglow with the sheen of the anticipation of God's promises for him. He was going to the one true home. Death was never a taboo topic, so I cannot fully understand why it is that none of my siblings picked up their portions of my father's ashes. True that we were taught that this physical form is just a vessel through which our true selves, our souls, enact God's work in this 3D realm, but it still seemed wasteful not to place some reverence, or at least respect, on the bag of bones that carried my father through his life and allowed him to show up for us in all aspects of self. The ashes of the others sat in the top of my mother's closet for years before my older sister threw them out, without circumspection or ceremony. She asked no one, not even my mother. A vicious pattern of entitled behavior that she will need to ask God to forgive her for. As for the others, it could be that rehoming his ashes would seem like a daunting thing to do. For me, it was a testament to my relationship with him and honoring one of his deepest heart's desires, to travel. Maybe one day, if the family is together in the same room once more, I will ask what they would have done with his ashes, or what they thought he would have wanted them to do with them, thereby getting to the foundation of their own personal relationships with my father. My tentative attempt to understand them better and garner much desired closeness, as my father would have wanted. Still, knowing how estranged we are at their silent suggestion, I foresee the futility of this inquest even now. Nothing short of death would allow for the possibility of us siblings once again sharing space physically or virtually. The unspoken understanding between myself and the others is that the phone is to be utilized during a crisis only, the crisis being life or death, not merely financial, professional, social, or emotional. This unyielding boundary exists that has been erected so long. It would take a revolutionary act to level it. My father's death was not such an occasion. Periodic phone calls on my part to the others would go either unanswered, ignored, or unresponded to. Even after having forgiven prior generations their residual epigenetic detritus by way of inherited unhealed trauma, addictions, coping skills, and survival propensities, I see so much more work I have to do in the state of these relationships. I see the very real effects of these curses and so struggle with my own personal healing. Healing, which is my responsibility despite any unwanted or unwarranted deference to toxic inheritances and interferences. This document is my vow, my prayer, my promise to do this with correct intention. In a vacuum, I am flawless, immaculate, indefectibly divine, and karmically clean. We all are. I am presently honoring myself as a future ancestor and breaking toxic bonds and the loop-to-looping karmic comedy circus that we are all born into. Our karmic contracts are signed before we enter this realm. We are born in relation one to another, to a mother and a father, and are of theirs before that. It is their karmic debt that we inherit and that we pay. If we are lucky, conscious, and self-correcting, we clear our debt, or at least take it to our graves, leaving our children unscathed. Otherwise, karma returns with our enslaved souls riding sidecar to the scythe to steal salvation from our progeny. So, with the burdensome knowledge of this eternal failure outside of that sterile, vacuous environment, I stagger forward on my journey through frightening dark uncertainty. I give to the ancestors my will, with the peace that comes from being open to the learning, wisdom and guidance to the ancestor that lies with and in us all.